Japan Air 123, request immediate. We have rapid decompression. Descending now. The voice cracking through the radio waves on that fateful evening of August 12, 1985, would become one of the most haunting transmissions in aviation history. Captain Masami Takahama's desperate plea echoed through Tokyo's air traffic control center as 524 souls aboard Japan Airlines Flight 123 found themselves hurtling toward an unimaginable fate. What began as a routine domestic flight from Tokyo's Haneda Airport to Osaka's Itami Airport would transform into the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history, a nightmare that unfolded over 32 agonizing minutes in the skies above Japan. The passengers had no idea that their evening flight home would become a terrifying fight for survival, trapped thousands of feet above the ground, with nowhere to run, and no escape from the mechanical catastrophe that was about to consume them all. The Boeing 747 SR-46, registration JA8119, was no ordinary aircraft, but rather a specially configured short-range variant designed specifically for Japan's dense domestic routes. Built in 1974, this particular 747 had already accumulated over 25,000 flight hours and more than 18,000 takeoff and landing cycles, making it one of the most heavily utilized aircraft in the world. The plane had been meticulously maintained by Japan Airlines engineering teams, yet hidden beneath its pristine exterior lay a fatal weakness that had been growing for 7 years, a structural crack that would ultimately seal the fate of everyone aboard. Captain Masami Takahama, 49 years old with over 12,400 flight hours, sat in the left seat alongside First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, who brought 4,000 hours of experience to the cockpit. Flight engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, with his 9,800 hours of technical expertise, completed the 3-man crew responsible for safely delivering their passengers to Osaka. None of these experienced professionals could have anticipated that they were about to face the most challenging 32 minutes of their aviation careers. The passenger manifest that evening read like a cross-section of Japanese society: families returning home from summer vacations, business travelers completing their workday, and children excited about visiting relatives. Among the 524 people aboard were entire families, including the Kawaguchi family of 5, who had spent a wonderful week in Tokyo and were eagerly returning to their home in Osaka. There was 12-year-old Keiko Kawakami, traveling alone to visit her grandmother, her young heart filled with anticipation for the reunion ahead. Businessman Hiroshi Yoshizaki sat in seat 56C, reviewing important documents for the next day's meeting, completely unaware that he would never make it to that conference room. The flight attendants, led by purser Masako Takahama, moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, ensuring every passenger was comfortable for what should have been a simple 54-minute journey across the Japanese archipelago. At exactly 6:12 p.m., Japan Airlines Flight 123 lifted off from Tokyo's Haneda Airport into the clear evening sky, climbing steadily toward its assigned cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. The takeoff was perfectly normal, with all systems functioning within parameters as the massive Boeing 747 gained altitude over Tokyo Bay. Passengers settled into their seats, some reading newspapers, others gazing out the windows at the sprawling cityscape below, while flight attendants began preparing for the brief beverage service. The cockpit crew ran through their standard cruise procedures, with Captain Takahama noting the beautiful weather conditions and excellent visibility that stretched for miles in every direction. Everything about Flight 123 appeared routine and unremarkable, just another evening departure in the busy schedule of one of Japan's most reliable airlines. The aircraft's 4 Pratt & Whitney JT9D engines hummed with mechanical precision, their combined thrust of over 200,000 pounds carrying the fully loaded 747 toward its destination with reassuring power and reliability. But at 6:24 p.m., exactly 12 minutes after takeoff, the normal rhythm of Flight 123 was shattered by a catastrophic event that would change everything in an instant. A massive explosion rocked the rear of the aircraft, sending violent vibrations throughout the entire fuselage as the cabin suddenly filled with a dense white mist. The explosive decompression was so violent that it felt like the aircraft had been struck by lightning, causing passengers' ears to pop painfully as the cabin pressure plummeted from a comfortable 8,000 feet equivalent to the actual altitude of 24,000 feet in mere seconds. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling compartments, swinging wildly as passengers frantically grabbed for them with trembling hands, their faces filled with terror and confusion. The sound was deafening, a roaring whoosh of air being sucked out of the aircraft through a massive hole that had suddenly opened in the rear pressure bulkhead, creating a wind tunnel effect that made it nearly impossible for anyone to hear or speak. Captain Takahama immediately felt the aircraft become sluggish and unresponsive to his control inputs, while warning lights and alarms filled the cockpit with urgent notifications of multiple system failures. "Something has exploded," shouted First Officer Sasaki over the cacophony of alarms, his voice barely audible above the roaring sound of escaping air. Flight Engineer Fukuda's hands flew across his instrument panel, trying to make sense of the cascade of warnings and system failures that were lighting up like a Christmas tree before his eyes. The hydraulic pressure gauges showed a complete loss of all three independent hydraulic systems, an almost impossible scenario that left the massive aircraft with severely limited control authority. Captain Takahama struggled with the control yoke, finding that the aircraft wanted to climb and bank to the right despite his efforts to maintain level flight, while the engines continued to run normally, providing thrust that was now becoming more of a liability than an asset. The crew immediately declared an emergency and requested vectors back to Haneda Airport, not yet fully understanding the extent of the damage that had been inflicted upon their aircraft. In the passenger cabin, panic spread like wildfire as people struggled to comprehend what was happening to them. The oxygen masks provided some relief, but the thin air at 24,000 feet made breathing difficult and left many passengers feeling lightheaded and disoriented. Children cried for their parents while adults tried to maintain composure, but the violent shaking and irregular motion of the aircraft made it clear that something was terribly wrong. Flight attendant Yumi Ochiai moved through the cabin despite the challenging conditions, helping passengers with their oxygen masks and trying to provide reassurance even though she herself was struggling to understand the situation. The aircraft's public address system had been damaged in the explosion, making it impossible for the crew to communicate with the passengers, leaving 520 people trapped in an aluminum tube with no information about their fate. Some passengers began writing farewell messages to their loved ones, sensing that their situation was more dire than anyone was willing to admit. The explosion that had crippled Flight 123 was the result of a structural failure that had been building for 7 years, dating back to a tail strike incident during landing at Osaka Airport in 1978. During that earlier incident, the aircraft's tail had struck the runway during touchdown, causing damage to the rear pressure bulkhead that separates the pressurized passenger compartment from the unpressurized tail section. The subsequent repair, performed by Boeing technicians, involved the installation of a splice plate that was supposed to restore the structural integrity of the bulkhead. However, the repair was not performed according to Boeing's own specifications, using a single row of rivets instead of the required double row, creating a weak point that would gradually deteriorate under the constant stress of pressurization cycles. Each time the aircraft climbed and descended, the faulty repair was subjected to enormous pressure differentials that slowly propagated fatigue cracks through the aluminum structure. After more than 18,000 pressurization cycles, the inevitable finally happened. The rear pressure bulkhead catastrophically failed, creating a massive hole that allowed the pressurized cabin air to rush into the unpressurized tail section with tremendous force. This explosive decompression not only created the immediate life-threatening situation for the passengers and crew, but also caused secondary damage that would prove equally devastating. The rush of air into the tail section blew out portions of the vertical stabilizer and damaged the control surfaces that were essential for maintaining directional control of the aircraft. Most critically, the explosion severed all 3 independent hydraulic lines that ran through the tail section, leaving the pilots with almost no ability to control their aircraft using conventional methods. The Boeing 747, despite its reputation for redundancy and reliability, had been rendered nearly unflyable by this single point of failure. Captain Takahama and his crew faced an almost impossible situation as they struggled to maintain control of their crippled aircraft. With the loss of hydraulic power, the primary flight controls became extremely difficult to operate, requiring enormous physical strength just to make small adjustments to the aircraft's attitude. The pilots discovered that they could achieve limited control by adjusting engine thrust, using differential power settings between the 4 engines to influence the aircraft's direction and rate of climb or descent. This technique, known as throttle-only control, had never been attempted in a commercial aircraft of this size and complexity, making the crew pioneers in a desperate form of aeronautical improvisation. Flight engineer Fukuda worked frantically to restore any semblance of normal control, trying emergency procedures and backup systems that might give them additional options, but the damage was simply too extensive for conventional solutions. The aircraft's erratic flight path took it in a wide arc northwest of Tokyo, climbing and descending unpredictably as the crew fought to maintain some semblance of controlled flight. At times, Flight 123 climbed to over 40,000 feet, well above its certified ceiling, as the pilots struggled to prevent a stall while simultaneously trying to descend toward a survivable altitude. The passengers experienced terrifying moments of weightlessness, followed by crushing G-forces as the aircraft pitched and rolled through the sky like a wounded bird. Through it all, the crew maintained communication with air traffic control, providing updates on their situation and requesting guidance, even though both sides knew that the options were extremely limited. Uncontrollable, Captain Takahama reported, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding him. We are uncontrollable. As minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the passengers aboard Flight 123 faced the horrible realization that their aircraft was in serious trouble. Some tried to remain optimistic, believing that the skilled crew would somehow find a way to land safely, while others began to accept the possibility that they might not survive this ordeal. Businessman Hirotsugu Kawaguchi used the flight stationery to write a farewell note to his wife, expressing his love and asking her to take care of their children. I don't want to inspire any sadness, he wrote, but the end may be near. Other passengers followed suit, creating a heartbreaking collection of final messages that would later be found among the wreckage, providing a window into the human drama that unfolded during those terrifying final minutes. The flight attendants, despite their own fear, continued to move through the cabin, offering comfort and assistance to passengers who were struggling with the effects of the thin air and the aircraft's violent movements. The crew's attempts to reach a suitable airport for an emergency landing were hampered by the aircraft's unpredictable behavior and their limited control authority. Initially, they had hoped to return to Haneda Airport, but the aircraft's tendency to climb made it impossible to descend quickly enough to reach the airport safely. Controllers suggested Yokota Air Base, a U.S. military installation with long runways that would have been ideal for an emergency landing, but again the aircraft's erratic behavior prevented the crew from establishing a proper approach. As the minutes ticked by, it became increasingly clear that conventional landing techniques would not be possible, and the crew began considering the possibility of ditching in Tokyo Bay or attempting to reach one of the more distant airports that might be within their limited range. The aircraft's flight data recorder captured every detail of the crew's struggle, preserving their professional competence and dedication in the face of an almost impossible situation. Captain Takahama's voice remained calm and controlled throughout the ordeal, even as he dealt with the most challenging flying conditions imaginable. First Officer Sasaki provided constant assistance, monitoring instruments and communications while trying to help find solutions to their predicament. Flight engineer Fukuda continued to work through emergency checklists and procedures, hoping to find some system or technique that might improve their chances of survival. Together, these 3 professionals represented the best of aviation training and experience, yet they found themselves confronting a scenario that no simulator had prepared them for, and no textbook had anticipated. As Flight 123 continued its erratic journey through the evening sky, the fuel situation became an additional concern. The aircraft had departed with sufficient fuel for the short flight to Osaka plus normal reserves, but the extended flight time and higher than normal power settings required to maintain control were consuming fuel at an accelerated rate. The crew had to balance their desire to remain airborne long enough to find a solution against the reality that their fuel would eventually run out, forcing them to attempt a landing whether they were ready or not. The weight of the fully loaded aircraft also complicated their situation, as the heavy landing weight would require a longer runway and more precise control inputs than they could reasonably expect to achieve with their damaged systems. Every factor seemed to work against them: creating a cascade of challenges that would have tested even the most experienced crew under the best of circumstances. During the extended flight, passengers and crew members had time to process their situation and contemplate their mortality in ways that few people ever experience. The knowledge that death might be imminent created a strange mixture of terror and acceptance, with some people finding unexpected reserves of courage and others struggling with overwhelming fear. Flight attendant Yumi Ochiai later recalled the surreal quality of those minutes, describing how people seemed to move in slow motion while simultaneously experiencing everything with heightened intensity. The normal social barriers between strangers began to break down as passengers reached out to comfort one another, sharing what might be their final moments with people they had never met before. Children who had been separated from their parents were cared for by other adults, creating temporary families bound together by their shared peril. The aircraft's increasingly erratic behavior made it clear that time was running out. Despite the crew's heroic efforts, Flight 123 was gradually losing altitude and becoming more difficult to control with each passing minute. The damaged tail section was creating enormous drag and instability, while the loss of hydraulic pressure meant that even small control inputs required tremendous physical effort. Captain Takahama and First Officer Sasaki took turns wrestling with the controls, their arms aching from the constant struggle to maintain some semblance of controlled flight. The artificial horizon and other flight instruments had become unreliable due to the aircraft's extreme attitudes, forcing the pilots to rely on outside visual references and their own inner sense of balance to determine the aircraft's orientation. It was aviation at its most primitive level, stripped of all the technological aids that normally make modern flying safe and predictable. As the sun began to set over the Japanese countryside, Flight 123 found itself approaching the mountainous region west of Tokyo, terrain that offered no suitable landing sites and little hope for survival in the event of an uncontrolled impact. The crew made desperate attempts to steer the aircraft toward flatter ground, but their limited control authority made precision navigation nearly impossible. Air traffic controllers watched helplessly on their radar screens as the aircraft's altitude decreased steadily, knowing that collision with the mountainous terrain was becoming increasingly likely. Emergency services were alerted and positioned as close to the aircraft's probable impact point as the rugged terrain would allow, but everyone involved understood that rescue operations would be extremely difficult in such remote and inaccessible areas. The final minutes of Flight 123 were marked by an almost supernatural calm in the cockpit as the crew exhausted their options and prepared for the inevitable. Captain Takahama's voice remained steady as he made his final radio transmissions, providing position reports and acknowledging the controller's instructions, even though both sides knew that normal procedures had become meaningless. The passengers, many of whom had been writing farewell messages throughout the ordeal, now faced the final moments of their lives with whatever courage and dignity they could muster. Some prayed, others held hands with strangers, and a few simply stared out the windows at the approaching mountains, accepting their fate with quiet resignation. The flight attendants took their crash positions, knowing that their chances of survival were slim, but determined to follow their training to the very end. At 6:56 p.m., exactly 32 minutes after the initial explosion, Japan Airlines Flight 123 struck the ridge of Mount Osutaka at an altitude of approximately 5,000 feet. The impact was catastrophic, tearing the aircraft apart and scattering debris across the mountainside as 520 people met their fate in an instant. The Boeing 747, which had served faithfully for over a decade, finally succumbed to the damage that had begun with a single structural failure and had gradually consumed its ability to remain airborne. The sound of the impact echoed across the remote valleys, marking the end of one of the most tragic chapters in aviation history and leaving behind a legacy that would forever change how aircraft are designed, maintained, and operated around the world. 4 passengers miraculously survived the crash, including flight attendant Yumi Ochiai, who would later provide crucial testimony about the final minutes aboard the doomed aircraft. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of the maintenance error that had initiated this tragedy 7 years earlier. Boeing's faulty repair of the rear pressure bulkhead had created a ticking time bomb that finally exploded on that August evening, demonstrating how a single mistake in aircraft maintenance could have catastrophic consequences years later. The accident led to immediate changes in inspection procedures, with special attention paid to pressure bulkhead repairs and the implementation of more rigorous oversight of maintenance work performed by manufacturers and airlines. The aviation industry learned that redundancy in design was not enough if a single failure could disable multiple systems simultaneously, leading to new approaches in aircraft architecture that would make similar accidents far less likely in the future. The human cost of Flight 123 extended far beyond the immediate victims, affecting thousands of family members, friends, and colleagues who lost loved ones in the crash. The Japanese nation mourned collectively for the passengers and crew who had perished, while the aviation industry grappled with the technical and regulatory changes needed to prevent similar tragedies. Memorial services were held across the country, and Mount Osutaka became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to honor the memory of the victims and to find some measure of peace in the aftermath of such senseless loss. The courage and professionalism displayed by Captain Takahama and his crew during their impossible 32-minute struggle became legendary within the aviation community, serving as an example of grace under pressure that continues to inspire pilots and air traffic controllers around the world. If this story has moved you and you want to hear more incredible tales of human courage in the face of unimaginable adversity, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that notification bell so you never miss our latest content. The lessons learned from Flight 123 continue to make aviation safer today, ensuring that the sacrifice of those 520 souls was not in vain, and that their memory lives on in every safety improvement that protects future generations of air travelers. Share this video with others who appreciate the remarkable stories of aviation history, and let us know in the comments which aircraft accident you would like us to explore next in our ongoing mission to honor the memory of those lost while educating others about the critical importance of aviation safety and the heroes who risk everything to keep us safe in the skies.